Well, my name is John Lilly, and this past week on June 12th was the 60th anniversary of my ordination as an elder in the then Methodist Church. Methodists have two levels of ordination. I was ordained a deacon in 1957, and deacons can do many things, but they can't serve communion, and they're mainly assistants to elders. So I was ordained an elder in 1960 by Bishop John Wesley Lord. He had a voice that was equal to Westminster Abbey, and he was very handsome. He said to me, John, a lot of people seem to expect a lot of you. And of course, the head of the formidable Board of Ordained Ministry for the New England Conference of the Methodist Church was my mentor and local pastor, so I had an in.
That's great. Well, congratulations on the anniversary of your ordination. And knowing that you were ordained an elder in 1960, but you were first ordained a deacon, which is no small thing, in 1957. That is, I think that would have been only 2 years after Emmett Till was murdered, right around the time that a lot of civil rights, and I have to check that date, but essentially around that time would have been the
mid-50s,
yeah, Emmett Till, and then and sort of the beginning of the civil rights movement. So I wanted to have a conversation with you today to just really get your perspective. You know, I think that perspective is something that would be so valuable at this time. Your perspective, having been in ministry through the civil rights movement, and then also being part of racial justice ministry now, even in your retirement, leading our justice and witness team here at United Church in Walpole. I'd love to hear from you what feels different and what feels the same about the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 1960s, and then this movement for Black Lives Matter today.
Well, the civil rights movement was very special. It gave us a sense of purpose. It had great leadership, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and many others. I first met Martin Luther King, I think I've told you, in 1958. I was in my final year for the Master of Divinity program at Boston University School of Theology, and he came to speak, and he was so impressive. I mean, he didn't have the sonorous sounds of later, but he was so sincere, and he'd been through so much, and he was going to be a professor, and he wound up being a pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and it fell to him to be the leader. Rosa Parks not moving to the back of the bus was terribly important, and a lot of good things happened in the civil rights movement. Many people tend to discount it because it didn't get the whole job done, but it dismantled a lot of Jim Crow, the Freedom Riders, Rosa Parks, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then of course 1965. And in those days, in the mid-60s, Martin Luther King was very much focused on policy, and the Civil Rights Acts, the two of them, were very important. The one on voting was important. It's still important. Now, there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of commitment. Some of my friends went to jail. There were many marches, many vigils. I sang "We Shall Overcome" arm in arm with blacks and whites together in a dozen churches or more, and locally and elsewhere. And it felt like the right thing to do for a Christian. We are all God's creation. There are no exceptions. We're all equal in the sight of God. So it felt like the right thing to do. What happened in the 60s, however, Vietnam came into play, and Martin Luther King became an advocate for peace, which earned him a lot of criticism, but he was right. And he also led the Poor People's Campaign. So it was beginning to evolve, but it lost a little bit of steam and the job was far from done. What's exciting about today is that across the whole world, there is outrage. There is a recognition that this is wrong. We need to do something about it. I talked to my brother this past week. My brother is a great guy and he buys and sells television stations. And we talked one more time about what television has done. Capturing that video. It was a young woman, a girl even, who stood there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and watched a policeman murder a black man. And his offense was relatively minor, but I listened to Senator Scott from South Carolina last night. He's been pulled over and stopped by police 7 times for minor traffic issues. You know, a black man in a car feels very vulnerable. But anyway, across the whole world, that's different. The whole world, Europe and Asia and Africa, everyone is marching, and the youth. You know, you and I have talked about millennials. Millennials have gotten roasted here and there for being me, but they are out marching. Mm-hmm. And it's blacks and whites, and they mean business. And they've already shown great courage and very great commitment. So it makes one hopeful. Now, the thing about movements like this is fatigue can set in. And worse than fatigue is backlash. And you and I have talked a little bit about that. And there's going to be backlash. There's already signs of backlash. There are signs of other groups with other agendas trying to insert themselves into the present moment. And keeping ourselves full of faith, full of commitment, full of a willingness to let's make this work. Racism is America's sin. It's right there from the very beginning. We've never really faced up to it. We need a national lamentation. We need national confession of sin. We need, some people are offended by reparations. We need investment. I copied one thing that I'll read a little bit of. In the 1960s, the musical voice for civil rights was Nina Simone. I loved her. I have most of her albums. I witnessed a couple of her live concerts. And she sang some powerful songs in the movement for women. Oh, powerful. When Martin Luther King died, the King of Love is dead. She sang, I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. She had a lot of passion, a lot of anger. And she had one tune she sang during the 60s called Backlash Blues. And it goes like this: Mr. Backlash, Mr. Backlash, just who do you think I am? You raise my taxes, you freeze my wages, and send my son to Vietnam. You give me second-class houses and second-class schools. Do you think that all colored folks are just second-class fools? Mr. Backlash, I'm going to leave you with the backlash blues. When I try to find a job to earn a little cash, all you got to offer is your mean old white backlash. But the world is big, big and bright and round, and it's full of folks like me who are black, yellow, beige, and brown. There's a lot of work to do, and we've got, you talk to a lot of folks, they mean well and they're sincere and they want to tell you, I'm not a racist. I want to tell them, go deeper.
Mm.
Educate yourself on white privilege.
Mhm.
We got a long way to go, but I'm very hopeful. And I listened to Obama talk about hope. And that's what's different right now because it's so spontaneous. It's so every state in America has had demonstrations after George Floyd's death.
Mhm.
And across the world, as we said, the same.
Yeah. Right down to the smallest towns. And it does, fill me with some hope. I do though know that, and this is where I want to dive in a little bit to your experience of the 1960s. I think as a young person who was born in the mid 80s, we were taught about Martin Luther King in school through a very sanitized version of history. And I think a lot of how younger people or people who weren't maybe even involved so much in civil rights, maybe they were just too young to really be processing what was going on at that time, maybe have a sense that, it wasn't tumultuous, that there weren't, lots of opinions, and that there wasn't, as you said, that backlash, that obviously everyone would have fought for civil rights because we all celebrate MLK Day and we celebrate, Black History Month, and isn't it obviously the right thing to do? And so I think that in this moment, to me, I feel like we are sort of in our own civil rights time. It is tumultuous. There is a lot of fear and uncertainty. And, that sort of like idea that it'll be crystal clear, how you should be engaging in this moment is something that I think some folks, some white folks like us or others kind of maybe didn't really understand what the 60s really were, that the vast majority of people in the 60s were opposing civil rights. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a fight, right? So, there's that kind of sense too. And I hear a lot of people talk about the rioting, which is really a very small piece of these demonstrations that have been going on now for, 20, how many days now? It's like, it's been so long. But we have seen some rioting, but there was rioting in the 1960s as well. And there was the peaceful work of MLK. So, it's always, part of me kind of wants to know, like, in terms of comparing the then and the now, is it similar in that sense of sort of anxiety and, what should I be doing right now? Or was it more morally clear then or now?
Let me tell you about calling on a family one time. Lovely couple, older couple. The woman had worked with me from time to time in the church office. Her husband was very ill. I called on him in the hospital. I called on him at home. I had prayer with them, and as I got up to leave, he lifted up Boston Globe front page. Martin Luther King was on the front page. He said to me, "That's the problem with the church today." Yeah. In the 60s, the churches didn't like what they thought were politics. And traditional thinkers tend to focus on the violence. Nobody likes violence. These demonstrations are remarkable, I think, for their peacefulness, but still, we hear that old refrain. It makes people comfortable with ignoring what the real message is. This time, it's more than about police reform. It's about a general awakening across the world. We are one people, all of us together. And I am hopeful. There were big crowds in the 60s. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, there were 250,000 people there. When he came to Boston in 1964 or 5, I was in the march from Roxbury to Boston Common. There were 20,000 people. Martin Luther King could put out a message to pastors, "Need you to be in Washington." I remember that in 1965. 10,000 pastors and lay people showed up to demonstrate for the Civil Rights Act. So there's a lot in common, but there's a lot to be hopeful about right now.
Now those calls are going out on Twitter, you know, and it's coming from the young leaders, though. I think that's one of the neatest things about this movement. It is totally decentralized. It's not about institutions or organizations or any real leader you can point to and say, there's the head of this movement, calling the shots or making calls. It's young people, it's high school students just putting out on Twitter, hey, I'm going to be here, come join me. I've heard of high school students organizing what ends up becoming thousands of people in their communities just through social media. So it gives me a lot of hope for real awakening, as you say, and for us to grapple with the sin of
you know what's wonderful also about millennials? Mm-hmm. They are masters of social media.
Well, you know, I have to clarify, now we're past millennials. Millennials are starting to get gray hairs. I say as a millennial. So these young kids in high school now, they're Generation Z. So even us millennials are too old to totally know what's going on. But yeah, the younger millennials and then this Generation Z are really so inspiring to me, and they're doing a lot of good work.
Yes, they see it so clearly, and they're all masters of media for sure. Yeah. And it helps. I mean, it keeps this going. Yeah. I also love the painting in Washington, D.C. on the street, Black Lives Matter. You can see that from outer space.
I know.
I saw another sign I liked this week, was very much improvised. All Black Lives Matter. And it's appropriate. I think, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Well, thank you so much, John. Any other things that you wanted to share, or any closing words?
Well, just words of hope, you know. I'm a positive guy by nature. It's fortunate for me, and I always tend to see hope, but I see it everywhere right now, and I am earnestly praying that hope will be fulfilled.
Me too. It is definitely my prayer. And I have great faith that it will. And I just pray that, you know, that God's time is right here, right now, but I know it'll happen someday.